Welcome to today's webinar, Performance-Based Funding for Higher Education, which is sponsored by the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices and the Legislative Education Staff Network, and is supported by an NCSL e-learning grant. For those who don't know, my name is Todd Haggerty, and I'm with the NCSL Fiscal Affairs Program, and I will be moderating today's program, which is being recorded and will be posted on the NCSL website for the use of legislative staff unable to attend this presentation. A growing number of states are turning to performance-based formulas to provide some amount of funding based on indicators such as course completion, time to degree, transfer rates, the number of degrees awarded, and the number of low-income and minority graduates. Many of the metrics used to evaluate performance of colleges and universities are designed to produce long-term results. However, states also need to monitor whether institutions are actively building the necessary capacity to promote student success in the short term. Today, we will hear from 3 national experts who will give their perspectives on performance-based funding for higher education, including metrics and strategies to evaluate the short-term effects of these formulas. Today's speakers are Matthew Hawkins, who serves as the Associate Commissioner and Chief Financial Officer for the Indiana Commission for Higher Education, David Prince, the Director for Research and Analysis with the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, and Russ Deaton, who is Associate Executive Director for Finance and Administration with the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. At this time, I will turn it over to Matt Hawkins, and please note that I should add this really quickly here, that we will have time for question and answers after we hear from our 3 presenters. You can pose a question at any time using the chat function on your screen by clicking on that little icon with the bubble. And with that, I will turn over to our first presenter, Matthew Hawkins.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm from the Commission for Higher Education in Indiana, and I'll just give you a very general overview of performance funding in our state. First, I'd like to give you a little background on the Commission in Indiana. We're a 14-member public body created to help define the missions of colleges and universities in the state of Indiana. The Commission helps plan and coordinate post-secondary ed and ensure education in Indiana is aligned with the needs of the students and the state of Indiana. We work predominantly with the state-funded schools, which are Indiana University, Purdue University, Ball State University, Ivy Tech Community College, Indiana State University, University of Southern Indiana, and Vincennes University. Prior to 2003, Indiana's funding for higher education was based on enrollment change and new academic programs. And in 2003, the state instituted a research incentive, which amounted to about $6 million in the total higher education funding for that year. It's now grown to 7 performance metrics. Those metrics in the 2014 fiscal year accounted for 6% of the operating budget, or about $68 million. The 6% came from a 2% operating reduction in institutions' operating funds and new funding of 3.8% in the 13-15 biennium. All the metrics in Indiana are based on the Commission's strategic plan, which is reaching higher, achieving more. During the 2013 biennium, we looked at academic year 2006, 7, and 8, and 9, 10, and 11. We used 2 3-year averages, and we used the change in count based on the averages of those 2 3-year periods. The first are our completion metrics. An overall degree completion is based on resident students only. It includes 1-year certificates, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral programs, and this metric is open to all institutions. This accounts for 30% of the performance funding, or nearly $20 million. This is the metric with the heaviest weight in our model. The second completion metric is at-risk degree completion, which again is resident students only. It includes 1-year certificates, associate degrees, and bachelor's degrees, and applies if the student's graduating with the degree is a Pell recipient at the time of graduation. This accounts for 15% of our performance funding formula, or nearly $10 million in fiscal 2014. The third completion metric is high impact degree. Again, resident students only, includes bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral programs in STEM. STEM is defined in Indiana as science, technology, engineering, mathematics, It's based on national standards. We also include architecture in Indiana because of one of our research institutions. Only Carnegie-ranked research high or very high campuses are included in this metric, and this accounts for 10% of our performance funding formula, or about $6.6 million. Our next metrics are based on progression. The first is a student persistence incentives. Resident students only provides incentives if a student successfully completes a set number of credit hours at an institution. Two-year institutions, this is 15, 30, and 45, and at four-year campuses, it's 30 and 60 credit hours. And again, this is where the student reaches the 15 credit hours. So we have transfers back and forth, but wherever the student meets 15 credit hours, that school or institution would receive the performance funding. This accounts for 15% of the formula, or about $10 million. Remediation success is another progression metric. Resident students only provides incentives to two-year institutions for students who successfully complete a remediation course and then gateway. I put a note at the bottom of that because with remediation, there was 0% of the performance funding pool placed in remediation, and that was because the Commission evaluated remediation success on count and percent of completers. So if you take a very simple example of 100 students enrolled and 15 complete, you have a 15% completion rate. If you have 350 enrolled and 45 complete, you have a 13% completion rate. And the reason the Commission looked at remediation in such a way is because completing gateway is not an output that's measurable towards the state's goal of 60% of Hoosiers having higher education. So that was that's how that's calculated. The next metrics are productivity metrics. The first is on-time graduation rate, resident students only, first-time, full-time, provides incentives for four-year institutions when students graduate in 4 years and two-year institutions when they graduate in 2 years. This is very important to the state of Indiana. It's 20% of the performance funding formula, or about $16.6 million. The last is an institutionally defined productivity metric. Again, these relate to the strategic plan of the Commission, and the schools, institutions submitted different metrics that they would like to be measured on, and then the Commission weighed those. Some examples that were chosen were funding per in-state bachelor's degree produced, student-faculty ratio, and the affordability index. Moving into the 15-17 biennium, we are reducing the institutionally defined productivity metric to a choice of 3. So each campus level institution will submit 3 that they would like to be measured on, and then the Commission will take all of those and narrow it down to 3, and each school will be able to pick one. This is one area that was relatively hard to measure. This accounted for 5% of the performance funding pool in the 2013-15 biennium. The policy impacts of performance funding. The formula was funded at really low levels before 2012. Again, it was a research incentive and amounted to about $6 million in a $68 million yearly pool of performance funding. In 2012 and 13, it was funded at 5%, and institutions lowered tuition fee rates and made a few other changes I have listed on this slide to meet the metrics and to receive the reward of those metrics. We moved to 6% in both fiscal 14 and 15. And again, that's all to increase the number of Hoosiers with higher ed to 60% by 2025. That is the focus in the state of Indiana. And some policy considerations I've noticed. Make sure the formula and metrics align with the state's priorities and goals. Keep the formula and metrics simple. We are in a process right now of creating a more simplified version of the reports that are produced by the formula so legislators can very easily understand all the metrics and what we're looking at. Collaboration with stakeholders. This was extremely important in Indiana because we are a coordinating body. So when we were creating our metrics, we were working with the institutions, with the legislature, policymakers, and any board that we could find that would have input on the metrics, so we had buy-in moving forward. Keep the formula in place for several years. The Commission just determined that we would keep the exact same metrics going into the next biennium. Again, one small adjustment was made in the institutionally defined metric, but it keeps everything very simple, and it provides consistency so the schools can react to the metrics and adjust to receive the performance funding. I will turn it over to David in Washington now.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see the symbol for advancing. Oh, the slides on my screen. So perhaps you'll have to advance them for me. Oh, here they are. Great. Okay, so my name is David Prince, and I'm with the Community and Technical College System in Washington State, and I'm the Research Director. And I'm going to talk about the Student Achievement Initiative, which has now been around for 6 or 7 years. And as I go through this, you'll see it's also gone through a pretty extensive external and internal evaluations. So most of what I'm talking about are some actual revised changes to the Student Achievement Initiative based upon the lessons we learned in those first 5 or 6 years. So the purposes of this initiative are twofold. One is to improve public accountability, and from our point of view, that means really trying to describe what happens to students in an open enrollment system when students are coming year-round to a system. And then it also represents a shift from funding entirely from enrollment inputs or enrollments to funding outputs. And so the term outputs here is important because a very large underlying principle of the Student Achievement Initiative is to look at things that are within the college's control within the year that they're being measured on. So brief history. We started the initiative in 2006-07. It was started after a year-long design process that was informed by national experts, research. The Community College Research Center out of Columbia was very instrumental in helping us with that. And then we launched it with actually a learning year. From 2008-09 to 12-13, we operated that system. I'll call it Student Achievement Initiative, or SAI 1.0. And it was basically measuring for attainment of 6 achievement milestones for basic skills, pre-college or remedial education, and then some credit accumulation within the first year, 15 college credits, 30 college credits. We're on a quarterly system in Washington State. Completion of college math, and then college completion itself. In that period, colleges were awarded for net improvement, comparing one year to the previous year. From basically the time it was launched, actually through the development process through 2012, CCRC conducted a quantitative and a qualitative evaluation of SAI, and that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then in 2012, the system conducted its own year-long review. When it was launched in 2006-07, the state board said it would be held in place for 5 years. That is one of the important things to keep in mind when you're doing these systems, is that they have to stay in place for a while, and they can't be changed or tweaked from year to year. So it would be held in place for 5 years, but then we would look at it to see what could be learned from it and what, if anything, needed to be changed or revised. So we conducted that year-long review. We also incorporated the findings from the CCRC studies, and that led to some recommendations and changes in both the milestone metrics, the achievement points that we're measuring, as well as how we were going to award funding for those points. So this year is actually the year that we've launched this new revised version. So what I'm going to briefly talk about today are why we talk about outputs, not outcomes, and I'm going to connect that to the principles, the design principles that we used. System engagement is very important in this, and we began the system engagement process by identifying principles both for measuring students and for funding, and then from there going forward with, okay, what are the metrics that are going to meet those principles and the funding model that's going to meet those principles. We measure intermediate and final outputs, and I'll talk about the lessons we learned from the first 5 years in terms of bringing intermediate outputs into the discussion of performance funding. I'll be talking about the revised framework and the metrics. I'll be talking about ways in which colleges are using their data, and then I'll talk briefly about the funding methodology we use for awarding performance funds based on these, based upon the performance that we're measuring. So first off, the principles for measuring achievement. We want to recognize all students in all mission areas. The community and technical colleges in Washington State have 3 mission areas: transfer education, professional technical education, but also adult basic education, and we wanted all of those students to be recognized. Our policy goal that we're connecting this to is raising educational attainment across the board for Washingtonians, and so that includes these basic skills students, and it includes trying to move all students towards post-secondary attainment, minimum of a year's worth of college, and a meaningful college credential that goes with that. We wanted to have measures that reflected the diverse communities served by the colleges. They're all in different parts of the state. They serve different types of communities. We wanted them to be understandable and meaningful. We wanted them to be things that could be influenced by the colleges on a timely basis, so basically in real time. So we're always looking at the current year. We're always providing data to our colleges and feedback to our colleges in the current year as it progresses along on where these students are. They're basically looking at their annual throughput. The measures are critical progression steps that move students forward, no matter where they start, towards greater achievement and completion. So let me briefly fold in some lessons that we learned from the first 5 years. One is to make sure the metrics support and reinforce best practices and processes. And so in the revisions, we put a greater focus on transitions. Community college students are coming from all different starting points, and there are a number of meaningful transition points for these students in order to progress along and be able to complete a post-secondary credential. One of the areas that we felt we were out of alignment in the first go-around was in the area of remedial education or developmental education, where basically we were awarding colleges for progressing students through developmental education. We revised that to say now that colleges are awarded when that student completes that the entire sequence, and they're given extra award if they complete in a timely basis the college level course that's related to that sequence. So we're looking more at not the sequence itself and what's done there, but at the student and moving them along further faster. The second part we looked at was year-to-year retention. As I said, we're looking at annual throughput, and so it's a cross-sectional view of the students that we're awarding funds to colleges. And we felt we had to create a greater attention to returning students and their continued progression in the year that they're returning. So that's been folded into these revisions as well. And then finally, we wanted to put a stronger focus on completions throughout all of this. And so there were a couple things that were done, both in the measures and then in the way that funds are awarded, to put a little bit more emphasis on completions. So let me go through the measures themselves. For achieving college readiness for pre-college, that includes both progressing through basic skills, earning a high school diploma, but it also then includes completing the pre-college sequence and then transitioning to actually completing the college level course that's related to that sequence. So now the points are awarded not incrementally as the student progresses through the system, but it's really rewarded at the end when the student completes that system, and at the end when the student completes those college level courses. All of that's got a time factor to it, and it basically, instead of awarding funds for process or for enrollments in these courses, it awards funds for really what can you do innovatively to move students faster through these courses, and then if you can do that, the awards come at that point in time. We've kept the focus on first-year college success, earning 15 college credits and 30 college credits. We've kept a focus on college math, which is really a major stumbling block. It's a major for all of our students, so whether it's not just passing it, it's avoidance of it, or it's inclusion of it within their pathway. There are many short certificates, for example, in professional technical education, which traditionally have been designed not to have college math, but by not putting math into those courses, you really make those certificates terminal for those students. We're trying to create pathways for students where they can go beyond that. Retention and progress. We've included some weighting for returning students who continue to increase their achievement in this, and we've created a way for colleges to readily identify those returning students and readily see where they are in this achievement milestone progress. So what we do for our students with all of these measures is we create a database that's returned to the colleges quarterly, and it shows to them where the students started the quarter and where they ended the quarter. It's a way for them to look at and manage their entire college enrollment, but not from an enrollment point of view so much as a progression and a completion point of view. We look at second-year college success, and this was an important new feature where we're looking at completion of 45 college credits towards a degree. So you'll notice when I talked about the 15 and 30 college credits before, that was a credit accumulation. This is a very specific set of credits that accumulate toward a degree, and it basically marks another very significant transition point that students are really in a program and are building a portfolio around that program, and that they're moving forward toward degree completion. Then the last one is completions, and it includes certificates, associate degrees, technical and transfer, and then apprenticeship training are all counted as completions. Within certificates, we've done some further work. We're still doing some further work and trying to look at our short certificates, and we basically put some minimal standards in place for those short certificates in terms of the number of credits that had to be included in those in order to be counted as a short certificate. And the purpose of that, again, is to make sure that we're preparing these students for a pathway and that the certificates we're awarding have labor market returns, but also have educational value in terms of coming back and being additives to a further credential. So from these, we've created a storyboard or a framework as to how we're looking at measuring student achievement. And it's basically as more students increase their basic skills in college readiness, they'll gain momentum from first-year college success, they'll finish college math, continue to earn credits in that second year, and they'll make progress and complete in greater numbers. So what we are providing with the colleges, again, is that annual data set, unit record, student by student, for every student enrolled, telling them what are the achievement milestones that this student has met, what are the achievement milestones that this student has to meet in order to go forward. Very quickly, ways that these are used and ways to understand performance. The points are accumulated and calculated every quarter, as I've been saying. Each college receives their points for every student on a student-by-student basis who enrolled the previous quarter to track their achievement during the year. The performance can be disaggregated by student characteristics and by program in order to analyze and measure student success strategies, and we're a big Achieving the Dream state, and that feeds into a lot of this. The points support cohort tracking for retention, progress, and completion, but they're not cohort-based. This is a cross-sectional view of all students, and the reason for that is because we wanted to not base performance on a small or uniquely defined cohort, for example, students new in fall, but we wanted to really align our system with the way that our colleges work, which is open enrollment throughout the year. And then the bottom line, which is another way of stating what I've been saying, is that this is really a progression and a completion management system. So all of our colleges have strong enrollment management systems. They all have ways to, for example, in June, project what their fall enrollment will be. When they come into an academic year and quarter by quarter, they have ways to understand how they're doing in terms of meeting their enrollment goals. They have strategies they can use and quickly put into place to adjust their enrollment goals. Open more sections for students if they see greater growth, close sections, move students around, but they're very strong because the system traditionally has been based on enrollment. At the same time, if you asked in the previous June, how many graduates are you going to have next year, how many completers are you going to have next year, what types of completers are you going to have next year, that would be harder to project. And the strategies to manage that in an open door, open access system would also be harder to describe. So what this is doing is it's trying to move the system from an enrollment management point of view to a completion point of view. So how are the funds awarded? Well, as I said, originally we awarded the funds based on net improvement from year to year. We found that was very much influenced by enrollment factors, and particularly in this past period where enrollments climbed significantly and then went down or are starting to come down now. So that very much affected the changes that would go on in terms of trying to make those current. So we look to move away from that, and we look to also look for a balance between various school characteristics, school size, mission mix, and so forth. And we've now come up with a three-legged funding model. The first one is total achievement, which is these total points produced, and that's what we're calling productivity. The second one is points per student, and that's looking at the total points produced and the total students in this, and just dividing the two out, but looking at from the efficiency point of view, how quickly are you moving students through? And then the last one is for total completions, to count above the certificates, degrees, and apprenticeships. The productivity one, total achievement, counts for 45% of our funding. The points per student counts for 45%, and then 10% is put into the completion pot. Currently, we have $10 million into student achievement, but our system is, and that comes from new money that was given to us from the legislature. Before that, we had under the old system a kind of a take-away earn-back model where some of the base allocation was converted to a performance pool that college could earn back. But as I said, there were some significant enrollment fluctuations that affected that. This is a much more stable, much more predictable way of doing things. Our system is also undergoing this year a review of its enrollment allocation model, and one of the things they're looking at is specifically related to that is how much more of that to shift into performance funding. So that's a process that's going on this year. So in summary, student achievement is both accountability and performance funding. For us, it's very important that colleges be measured for real-time performance that they can observe and influence. Performance encompasses all missions and all students. And as I said, what we're trying to do is shift some of the culture away from enrollment management focus as the main driver to a performance management system. So I think that concludes me, and with that, I'll turn it over to Russ.
Great. Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the NCSL staff for having the webinar today, and thanks to Matt and David for the overviews of their respective states. I want to quickly talk about Tennessee's background of our formula and roughly the moving parts of how it works, but then get quickly into talking about the evaluation of the model and trying to determine whether or not a formula is indeed working. By way of background, both of the Complete College Tennessee Act from 2010 and our current Drive to 55 efforts from the current and most recent governor to essentially try to increase educational attainment in Tennessee and better prepare the workforce. These are essentially the driving components behind the funding formula here in Tennessee. And in order to reinforce those policy goals, 4 years ago, Tennessee completely discontinued the enrollment-based formula that it had operated for probably the better part of 4 or 5 decades, and we built a new model that's entirely based on outcomes. Enrollment just simply no longer factors in whatsoever to how much money our campuses receive. To give you a visual for this, these pie charts sort of illustrate that. For years, we had a largely enrollment-based model with a small slice for a very classically designed performance funding program, classical in the sense of very typical, the way most states did performance funding. And then moving ahead into the new era, we threw out the blue part of the pie, the enrollment-based model, and instituted the outcomes model, and that's what we've been operating under ever since. The history of these programs in Tennessee, at least, taught us the limited leverage you get when you have a small program. Ours operated at about a 5% level for that era, and to Tennessee, that was just not generating the leverage we needed for institutional change. The outcomes model then was built, of course, and through that model, we inject the entirety of the state appropriations to our higher education institutions. In other words, all $850 million or so that the General Assembly puts into higher ed in Tennessee is funneled through the outcomes model. We've essentially also removed what I'll call the entitlement mentality from funding in the sense of what a school received in a prior year is automatically what it gets the next year, except for some adjustments here and there. Essentially, all money has to be earned anew from the ground up each and every year. It's built from the ground up every year. Two basic moving parts that I can go into more detail if there are questions about it, but the exclusive use of outcomes rather than enrollments. We have a unique set for the four-year institutions, a different set for the community colleges, and then we also then weight those outcomes differently based on the mission of that campus to try to get at what that campus will be funded on, what they ought to be producing, what their mission is to serve their local area, local workforce. So the questions, is our model working? And this is a complex question, and it's not an easy one to answer. There's several ways we look at this question when we think about it. The first is that we think it is a matter of fact that state taxpayer funds are being more efficiently distributed to institutions. The fundamental question really that every state deals with is how do you allocate taxpayer funds to institutions? I mean, every finance policy attempts to answer that question, and the old answer we used here was enrollment. The new answer is outcomes, of course, and we think that's just a more efficient way for state taxpayer funds to be allocated by campus. So in that surface level sense, it is working because it's a better way for state government at least to determine how it should allocate funds to institutions. To get into the numbers a little bit, the quantitative answer is more complicated. We can look back over the first 4 years of our model, and we have seen outcomes increased. Bachelor's degrees are up, graduate degrees are up. Our community colleges do more workforce training. They generate more certificates. Of course, causality is difficult to determine. Would that have happened anyway? It's not easy to determine. Many of those outcomes would have probably gone up no matter what. Like most states, we had an enrollment surge in Tennessee that produced more outcomes. That would have happened regardless of what the finance policy stance was. However, we do think that part of the increase has been our campuses focusing much more heavily on how to allocate their own internal funds to produce more outcomes. But most definitely a longer-term analysis will be required to really determine whether or not a formula that is this aggressive actually can produce increases in outcomes. There's a lot of research now that looks back on Tennessee and other states in the old performance funding era, and it's sometimes difficult for the researchers to determine a link between the finance policy, between performance funding and the outcomes. We'll have to also address that in the coming years with our model here in Tennessee. On a qualitative sense, though, we have seen an extraordinary response from our campus presidents and their staffs. We hear evidence all the time from both leadership on the campuses, from the governing boards, that there is really not an aspect of the campus that hasn't been touched by the model. I mean, the fact that you only earn $1 when you produce an outcome has really refocused the energy and the efforts of our institutions. So in that sense, it is in fact working, and it has achieved the goals we set out for. You see that manifested in lots of different ways, but our presidents tell us that it has really caused a cultural change on the campuses, which I guess is the whole point of trying to craft a finance policy. We're studying this qualitative nature a little more in depth. Tennessee was fortunate to get a grant from the Ford Foundation to extensively study this question of whether or not campus policies and practices, campus culture, whether or not that has changed now that you have a purely outcomes-based formula. We've got some external researchers who are doing the research. They're going on to campuses. They're observing events. They're talking to students and staff and faculty. They're even talking to the upper-level administration. They're talking to everyone they can to find out what has changed on your campus these last 4 years as a result of the state changing to an outcomes-based model. That study is ongoing now. We hope to have it completed by next summer to really bring some evidence to bear about whether or not this has indeed worked. And on a more global level, I mean, we think that basic economics still applies to institutions, that incentives matter, and that when funding, like it was in our state, is largely based on enrollment, then that's what schools will largely focus on. And that's not a bad thing, but in Tennessee at least, now that completion is really paramount. We think shifting the funding towards focused on outcomes exclusively is better for us at this moment in time. And so in that sense, we think that incentive structure matters. It will prompt campuses to change. We've already started to begin to see that. We hope to see that further in the future. So we do need a more complete answer to the overall question of whether it's working. We have been satisfied here with our experiment so far that it is mechanically possible to do a 100% outcomes model. We think we found a good balance between a model that's volatile enough but also stable enough for campuses to do some planning. And we have thus far had some evidence that it is indeed having that campus response that we hoped it would, and that's the point of changing a policy of this magnitude. With that completes my slides, and I will hand it back over to the NCSL staff.
Well, Russ, thank you very much, and also thank you to David and Matt as well. Now we have some time for questions. So again, to pose a question to the group, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You should see there with a little bubble, and just type that in, and it can come through. And we do have our first question, and this is for you, Russ, and this is just looking for a point of clarification for Tennessee funding. Is all of it through the performance funding formula, or is there an exemption for, let's say, capital operations, maintenance? Would that go through a non-formula?
If there's appropriations directly for, say, a new building or a major capital maintenance project, that is a different process. That is subject to appropriations. Sometimes we get money, sometimes we don't. That's a different process. For routine maintenance, for utility usage, et cetera, there is a small slice of the model. It's probably about a 10% piece that does reflect back fixed costs to the campus. That is a component of the model, yes.
Thank you. And let's see, and this one's for everyone here, and I'll throw it to David or Matt first here, so one of you can jump in. The question is, have any of your approaches used a primary pool of money to award performance and a secondary pool of money to be targeted to help institutions improve performance or address deficiencies? And is there any merit to this type of approach?
David, do you want to go?
Sure, I can go first. So we have not had a pool for funds for colleges that do not. In our first go-round, however, we had some funding that we gave to every college before the initiative started, that learning year that I called it, in order to adjust and look at the practices themselves. So that spread across the board to every college. In our current system, every college will receive funds, but we have not. We don't have anything targeted to those that are performing less well than others.
And I would say in Indiana, there was a pool of research funds from 2003 till 2012, and that was based on research. And then all new performance funding has been a combination of reduction in base and then adding any new money into the performance funding pool. And I would just say, if you're addressing inefficiencies and things like that, or deficiencies, you'd just need to be able to apply that consistently statewide. And I'm not sure that there's just a right answer for every state, because all of our systems are set up so differently.
Great. Okay, we have another question here for Russ. And Russ, could you just kind of summarize what are the outcomes that are being measured?
Sure. At universities, it is student progression benchmarks, similar to Washington. So as the student accumulates progress towards a degree, those are small weights, but those are in the model. And then bachelor's degrees, master's, doctoral degrees, a research expenditure level, graduation rate. So looking back at first-time freshmen, prior to see what portion graduated, as well as a degrees per FTE metric, which is also a measure of efficiency, but a little bit different from graduation rates. Community colleges, somewhat similar, though some pretty significant differences. There is some progression metrics, also the associate's degrees, certificates. We count up the number of job placements. We count up remediation success, similar to Indiana and Washington. We count up the number of contact hours that are done for workforce training, as well as student transfers and dual enrollments. One point there is no graduation rate in the community college model.
Thank you. So another question here, and I'll toss it out to the whole group again. If the emphasis is on completion, is that limiting the kinds of students that institutions are admitting? And are any seeking at-risk students?
So in ours, which is strictly a community college performance funding system, that's a huge point of concern. And so that throughout the first 5 years in the CCRC evaluation and so forth, by looking at these milestones and making sure they encompassed all missions, we basically removed any disincentive for serving any particular kind of student because we're measuring performance across the board. So that's not happening. In our new model, where we've specifically called out completions, and actually there's a specific performance funding pot for that, that was one of the concerns. Will this happen or not? But again, by including points across the board, and by including these measurements for returning students and extra incentives for students who are moving along, we have, I think, mitigated to the best we can against those kinds of unintended consequences. So I think when you include these intermediate milestones, and particularly if you start them at the beginning for all students, you have a pretty good. The odds are very strong that you will mitigate against that happening.
This is Russ. Matt, did you want to go? Okay. This is Russ in Tennessee, and I agree with what David said. And in Tennessee, both of our 2-year and 4-year schools, there's a premium for low-income and adult students. Essentially, if you graduate 100 low-income students, our model acts like you graduated 140 of those. So there's a very hefty premium for low-income students who are at risk. And at universities, 2 of our outcomes are the traditional graduation rate, but then, of course, also just the raw numbers of degrees. And for every one of our schools except the flagship, the raw number of degrees is weighted much more heavily than the graduation rate. And that was explicitly done so schools wouldn't be faced with the choice of either limiting access or trying to increase a graduation rate. And so we mitigated that problem at our universities with the weighting approach.
And in Indiana, we've tried to address it by putting 15% of the entire performance funding pool towards Pell recipients. And I think the completion, we have one community college in Indiana, and they've really tried to focus on advising and counseling, and any students that they get in the door, they're really trying to work with them to get them through and to get them to complete. So I think it's actually created more of a focus on completing.
Great. Another question here, and this one's typical of performance-based funding throughout the years, is what happens to universities that don't meet their targets with that funding? Does it lapse, or is it redistributed to other institutions? And I'll kind of throw that out there.
In Indiana, we don't penalize schools if their count is smaller or reduces. It's only when their count increases that they're rewarded. They're not penalized.
So in Washington, you said universities, but I'll talk about the community colleges. The funding is awarded based on a share basis of the pool. So we do not have targets for the institutions. We have a share basis based on performance, and they can see their performance and everybody else's as well. So the incentive, there is competition in this, but there are not specific targets that you can miss. Everybody will receive performance funding. Whether you maximize the performance funding you could get or not really it depends upon some of those efficiencies of points per students and completions per student and so forth.
Yeah, and that's roughly the same in Tennessee. There's no targets or goals in our model either. We're just counting up what you produce, and so the more you produce, the higher your counts, the greater share of whatever available state funding that school will receive.
Okay, and so going back with that question on counts here, we have a question from a state that has not yet implemented performance funding, but has developed, looking at developing metrics, and one of those is completions. And the concern is that the difference between numbers and the rate. So the number of completions might go up, but the rate could actually go down. So should we be measuring the rate of completions or simply the number of completions?
In Indiana, we would say number.
Washington, too, would say number, and I think most of the national experts would say look at numbers, not rates, because there are lots of things that can influence the denominator and many unintended consequences in what can influence the denominator. So make sure you're including all students in your measures and then look at numbers.
Yeah, this is Russ. I would join that amen chorus, and I would say the way we thought about it was the numbers are fine because the concern really is one of efficiency. But if you're sufficiently incentivizing your institutions to focus on numbers, I mean that in itself is an efficiency incentive for them to find the best way, the quickest way, the most effective way to get that student to completion. So by focusing on the numbers, you really capture the efficiency metric at the same time, because the campuses have an incentive to produce more, however they can find a way to do so, focusing on the what, not the how.
Okay, and we got another question. This one's going for you, Russ, again in Tennessee. So how much variance in annual funding is there per institution, and what are the biggest and smallest percentage changes?
Good question. Well, the model's designed to where if everyone's outcomes, if their counts are going up at roughly the same rate, then no money changes hands. It's not until you see schools begin to perform better or worse than other schools where their share changes. Because of that, we have seen movement these first 4 years. In any given year, it's within a plus or minus 3 to 4% range, and by that what I mean is whatever the overall state funding level is moving at, then our schools are within 3 or 4 points of that overall. So for instance, if state funding drops by 5%, our schools will usually drop somewhere between 2 and 8% or so, and of course that then compounds every year.
Perfect. So unless
in Indiana,
no apologies.
Right.
Go ahead.
In Indiana, in our performance funding pool, we had one school drop 0.06% and one school increased by 7.5% in 1 year.
So in Washington, under our old system, it was a win or lose proposition, and lose meant you got nothing. So you could have huge fluctuations, and a lot of that had to do with changes in enrollment, not necessarily changes in performance, which is one of the reasons why we changed our system. Under the new one we've been looking at now, we've just had 1 year of it, but I would say that the changes would probably be in the 2 to 3% range a year.
Excellent. So unless there are any other questions, I think we've kind of come to the conclusion of today's webinar. And please remember that this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the NCSL website along with a PDF version of the slides today. Should you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact myself or my colleague Dustin Whedon. You can see our email addresses on the screen there, and we can work with the presenters that were with us today to help resolve any additional questions that you may have. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this webinar, and a special thank you to our presenters today, Matt Hawkins, David Prince, and Russ Deaton. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great Friday and a great weekend.